Well, hello everyone. This is just a recap of the week one discussion board. I will try to do this every week. If I'm doing it right, I will do it every week. Just taking some excerpts from student work on the discussion board and just freely commenting on it. This is not in any way any judgment about what were the best comments or what were the most insightful comments, but simply those things that I found interesting or things that touched upon issues that I think are worth discussing. Let me say, first of all, that as a teacher, I was very pleased with the week one discussion board. It was very good. I mean, the comments were very thoughtful, and I thought there was a very energetic discussion of things going on. And I think that many of the issues brought up are quite important, and I'm glad to see so much intelligence and work reflected, so much thoughtfulness reflected in it. Let me just say that right away. But let's get to some of the things that were said. Just taking them more or less at random. The things that I saw. And again, when I excerpt these, I just want to attach names. I don't think that that's what I should do, but we're discussing things. And whatever. We all know what we're saying. Here's an interesting comment. One line that really stood out to me was that it stated that engineers directly impact the quality of life for people. That's from the preamble, I believe. This powerful statement makes me agree that engineers should remain honest, impartial, and hold safety, health, welfare as paramount. It also brings up the fact that there shouldn't be any betrayal between employers, employees, contractors, and clients. This is an important part of building a team, which I find is an integral part of engineering. As an engineer, you have to work with many people from all backgrounds, and you need there to be a foundation of trust between everybody for the project plans to run smoothly. It allows for the team to feel supported and work well with each other. Well, what a great comment, or what a great thought. What an interesting thought in many ways, an intelligent thought. But I found it striking because the student, and I think this is quite natural and true, pointed out that engineering is oftentimes a team effort. Let me tell you right now that I am not an engineer. I have no experience in engineering. I am a philosophy teacher. I have learned, I would believe, just enough about the profession of engineering in order to do a competent job as a teacher of this course. But it is my understanding that engineering, as is done by the vast majority of engineers, is a team effort. That is, most engineers, and we'll see this as an issue in engineering ethics, are employed by corporations or businesses, oftentimes by large businesses, large corporations, publicly held corporations, and that they are employees. And the modern employee perhaps employees in general, have always been encouraged to be team players or to work in teams. The nature of the work is to work in groups or work in teams. I'm sure that is both true and fine. However, one of the things I wanted to point out is that the notion of a profession is more or less a traditional and to some degree old-fashioned notion insofar as it's based upon a certain conception of the professional, especially the medical or law professional, who is an independent contractor. I think that is a facet of professional codes of ethics, which is probably essential, and for that reason makes them problematic. If we look at the codes of ethics for lawyers, doctors, and the NSPE code of ethics for engineers, they more or less have as the exemplar or as the sort of ideal type of the professional is the person who works independently. This will become more of an issue as we go on, as we negotiate the difficulties of engineering ethics, is that the notion of professional is that someone who is more or less autonomous. and is not working in a group, has total control over their project in the way that a doctor has, in a certain respect, of course, negotiating with the patient, has total control over his or her decisions about the patient's health. The lawyer who is working with a client who has total control, autonomy over what they see as the client's best interest. That may not be realistic when it comes to the way that engineers actually work. And again, that is an issue that will become more prominent, especially in the last part of the course when we really start looking at the fourth canon, that very problematic canon that asks you to be a faithful trustee of your client or employer, and which is probably a difficulty or a problem in the code insofar as it doesn't recognize that there's a big difference between having a client and having an employer. There is all sorts of talk about employers in the code, but I would say that the fundamental approach of the code, it has the traditional autonomous independent contractor engineer who has maybe their own practice or something in mind, and that is a difficulty that we will be working with as we go along. So it's interesting to point that out. Here's another comment that I found interesting. When looking through the codes, I also find it off-putting when the code states that, quote, engineers shall perform services only in the areas of their competence. Engineering is a profession where its members are constantly pushing boundaries into unexplored territories. If an engineer is working on groundbreaking technology, creating new types of chemicals, or developing an innovating product that no other person has ever attempted, should they be allowed to do so? According to the codes, if these pioneers are attempting to further develop society, then they should not be considered professional engineers, as there is no way for them to be competent in their field. I know some may say that this criticism depends on how harshly one interprets the term competent, but I just cannot seem to understand why this notion needs to be included in the codes. Engineers are made to help the people of the world, but if they do not possess the experience, does that mean they have to sit on the sidelines and watch disaster unfold when they could have tried to help? I mean, that's a great comment, a very thoughtful one. And I really appreciate the critical reading of the code. I really encourage that. I have great respect, I must say, for the NSB Code of Ethics. On the other hand, this is a philosophy course. It is not a course that simply assumes that whatever we read is correct and we should all agree with it. I don't know what such a course would look like. I don't think any course is like that, but certainly not a philosophy course. We're meant to be skeptical. We're meant to be critical of everything that we read. So bravo, I'm glad to see this. But let's take a look at the point that's being made, which is an interesting point. The idea is that this aspect of the code that demands that engineers shall perform services only in the areas of their competence could restrict innovation and the usefulness of engineering. And I think that's a very interesting point. And to a certain extent, it would be very unfair to criticize it for me at this point. So I will try not to do that, except to say that the things that we'll read during week 2, which are not about engineering specifically, but about professionalism in general, they point out certain things which are worth keeping in mind. And the most important thing that we'll see in week 2 is in Paul Sieghart's essay when he basically grounds the notion of professional ethics in the professional-client relationship, which would be relying upon our grasp of medicine and law, the kind of relationship that a lawyer has with their client or a doctor has with their patient. Certainly, engineers innovate, and engineers strike out into new territory, but within the confines of a professional relationship. That is, when you have accepted somebody as your client, you have basically asked for their trust. So, as I think I responded in the discussion board, which I rarely do actually participate in the discussion board, but the kind of innovation, experimentation, the kind of creative thinking, and the kind of pushing of boundaries that this student is talking about is quite important. I'm sure. I wish I was the kind of person who could do that. On the other hand, within the confines of a professional relationship, when you have actually promised somebody to put your services or put your skills at their service, I wonder about taking risks. I wonder about pushing boundaries. Maybe there are certain contexts in which pushing boundaries, experimentation, working outside one's competence in order to learn or develop new things is out of place. And I think that within the professional relationship, it may be that there are certain situations in which you simply cannot do that kind of experimentation. I'd also like to point out that one of the interesting things about the code, and I think especially about the NSPE code, is that it's a product of history. Everything that's in that code is in the code for a reason. It doesn't mean that the code is always correct, but it's in there for a reason, and the reason is that it's a problem that has cropped up in the practice of engineering that this professional society has thought important enough to address. And if there is a part of the code that directs engineers to perform services only in their area of their competence, it means that somewhere along the line, an engineer took on a job that they were not competent to do. That is, one can imagine that such situations are fairly common, especially if you are in business for yourself, and especially if your livelihood depends on getting engineering work. It might be a temptation in some contexts to take on work that you really shouldn't because you need the work. I'm not saying that this student overlooked such situations. They weren't even thinking about those things. It was not a criticism of this comment, but perhaps a little context, perhaps a little defense of that part of the code. That is, that one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the ordinary person has no real grasp of what engineers do, and probably has no real grasp that there are different fields of engineering. This puts the ordinary person at a certain loss, makes them vulnerable. If you call yourself an engineer, you have a degree in engineering, and somebody needs something done, they probably don't grasp that, well, there are electrical engineers and mechanical engineers, civil engineers, process engineers, computer engineers. So this part of the code, however ambivalent we may be about it, it's there for a reason. It's there because engineers have in the past taken advantage of people who didn't know any better. That is, who didn't realize that not all engineers know every field of engineering. This was in the same discussion or the same thread. Students said, I do agree, however, that the code of ethics are rather rigid in their verbiage and writing. It makes you question things and possibilities of where the rule is not followed, but is still considered ethical. Well, I mean, sure. One of the things we should keep in mind about the NSPE Code of Ethics is it has 3 sections. And the first 2 sections are really the ones that I concentrate on. And if we look at the first 2 sections, the first one is the statement of the fundamental canons. That's section 1. Section 2, which is called Rules of Practice, is basically a specification and elaboration upon the first 5 canons. So what that tells us right away is that you have a general rule, and that would be the canon. That's what a canon is. It's a general rule, a general principle, a foundational principle or assumption. You have a general rule, and then you have how that rule needs to be applied. And the second section is some guidance in applying the rule. I think that, and this is, of course, a decision that everyone has to make for themselves, but I think looking at the fundamental canons, personally, I find it hard to really question the validity of any one of them. And that's pretty common in ethics and morality, is that what I have found as a philosophy teacher teaching countless moral philosophy courses and just straight up moral philosophy courses is that human beings are pretty quick to agree on the general principles, but the difficulties come in how they're applied. So if we talk about a rule not being followed, I think there's a big difference between a canon outright not being followed and, let's say, one of the rules of practice being strayed from. It would be a big difference. I'm not saying that the canons are absolutely sacrosanct and can never be questioned, or these are obviously correct, but I think it's a big difference. Let's say something like the first canon. If you were to outright ignore the first canon, that would be a big deal. That would be highly questionable. Now, if you were to have big difficulties or refuse to follow one of the specifications of the first canon in the rules of practice in section 2, that would be something else. I mean, much more reasonable, I would say. This is also in the same thread, following that remark about the thing about competence. Somebody said, to be frank, I think the code of ethics for engineers should, at the very least, be updated to reflect the current state of technology development and needs of the world. It is a very narrow-minded attempt at uniting engineers without considering the boundaries that are being pushed every day and the new problems that engineers face. I mean, that's a very interesting criticism. And again, it follows upon that initial criticism of the competence canon. And it raises big issues. The world changes. It does. Certainly the world changes in terms of technology, and the world changes socially. But I wonder, does ethics change? And especially, do the fundamental principles of ethics change? That is, and this raises a very important question, I believe. I'm not dismissing this criticism. I think it's a very thoughtful one. But I wonder, when we look at the the 6 canons, and we look at the first part of the code, I wonder, is there anything in history that we can really point to that has invalidated or outdated those principles? Is there anything that demands, if the code needs to be revised, and personally, I do think that in some respects it does need to be revised. And we'll see my own ideas about that for what they're worth later in the semester when we read Thomas Hemplin's essay on the 4th canon, which was a research project that an honors student did for me several years ago. I do believe that there are certain aspects of the code that need to be revised, or at least one aspect that needs to be revised. Although I wonder about that first section. The world changes, but what exactly does that mean in terms of ethics? I mean, the student has done a very good job, I think, here in raising that question, but it is a question. Another interesting comment here. The one question I have for you is, how will engineers know when they have made the right choice when faced with a decision? What a great question. I mean, it's a fundamental question of philosophy. You stated that everyone should be able to interpret the rules based on their own morals, but wouldn't that cause a lot of problems? If all engineers were to do what they think is right, then the code would be violated every day, and engineers would be getting away with going against the rules without consequence. Also, if it is true that engineers must follow this code to be considered professionals, then would these engineers still fit that title? Well, professional is something that you are by virtue of belonging to a profession. You can act unethically as a professional. It doesn't make you a non-professional, it makes you a bad professional. But these questions I think, are all really good questions. I forget exactly what the student was responding to in terms of another student's post, but here it says, you stated that everyone should be able to interpret the rules based on their own morals. Well, that's an interesting point. I would say no. Ultimately, we are beholden to our own consciences. That is true. On the other hand, the whole idea of a professional code of ethics is that by entering into the profession, you more or less accept the code, the validity of the code. I suppose if that code in some way or another violated your own moral beliefs, then you probably shouldn't enter the profession. Is the idea. Maybe that's a little harsh, but I think that's the idea. The notion of a profession-wide code of ethics is that it provides a baseline, a consensus on professional behavior. And that although, again, we are all beholden to our own consciences at the end of the day, that by entering into the profession, you also implicitly accept its code of ethics. For instance, something, again, let's say the most important canon probably is the first canon, the health, safety, and welfare of the public, to hold paramount that. I think the notion is that if you're going to be an engineer, you simply have to accept that. That is, even if in some way or another you have a moral difference with that, you have to suspend it. You have to suppress it. Now, does that go for every detail of the code? Probably not. On the other hand, it's an interesting thing, and it is an issue in engineering ethics or any professional ethics, is that when you enter into a profession, you have, to a certain extent, agreed to abide by a certain set of rules and practices. I think that is the idea. But great comment. Student here, very interesting comment. I support having a code of ethics for a profession, but I can't help but second guess some of the ideas in that code. It's a no-brainer that an engineer should not do anything that will harm a person or their property. But what if no one's rights are violated? Looking at rule of practice 5A, if someone says they're qualified as an engineer and is able to deliver a product seamlessly, but they don't actually have a license, how unethical are they really being? Again, that's saying that no rights are violated. Well, that's exactly what's at issue. What is 5A again? I think I might have to look it up. I can't remember what 5A is. Let's see. I'm sorry, I should know. I have a feeling I know, but I want to make sure I know what the student is referring to. 5A, engineers should not falsify, they should not represent. Yes, okay, about representation of qualifications, a similar point to only practicing in areas of competence. Well, this is a very interesting comment, I think. And it mentions licensure. Well, the truth of the matter is, as far as I know, is that, of course, engineers don't have to have a license. Most engineers are not PEs. Most engineers do not have a license. You have to pass the PE exam to get your license, to be a licensed engineer, to be a PE, a professional engineer, and the vast majority of engineers do not do so. I think that it is more common in civil engineering than any other form of engineering for various reasons, but the truth of the matter is that engineers in general do not get licensed. They can, they are encouraged to do it, but most of them don't. That is an issue. When we read Spindell's essay on licensure, his whole point is that that's a bad thing. That is a bad thing for the public, and it's a bad thing for the engineering profession that engineers don't have to be licensed. That it holds the profession back, and it's not doing right by the public. Now, that I'm not saying I believe that, but it's definitely so. Anybody can call themselves an engineer. People who don't even have an engineering degree call themselves engineers. I read a couple years ago. I read Steve Wozniak's autobiography. The guy who co-founded Apple, and he talked about being an engineer. He didn't have an engineering degree. I mean, so there is something. I mean, doctors and lawyers can't call themselves doctors and lawyers unless they have law or medical degrees, and unless they pass licensing exams. Engineers don't. So it does call into question that rule of practice. I mean, what does it actually mean? That rule, as I look at it, is about representation. and about being honest in the way that you describe your own education, background, and competence. If you can actually deliver the product without having the degree or having the license or having the experience, well, again, I'm not saying that there's anything irrational or wrong about this comment, but within the professional relationship, that is, within the professional client relation, I would say that different rules apply. And in business in general, if you can deliver the product, that's all anybody cares about. But in professional ethics, it might, and I just say might, actually be different. Insofar as even if you can deliver the product seamlessly, are you being entirely transparent in the way that a professional needs to be transparent with their client? See another interesting comment. Not only that, the article brings up that establishing a strong set of morals for a company allows that company to seem more trustworthy through the public eye. But it should not only seem that way, it should actually be that way. I do, in fact, support the creation of a code of ethics, as it can be valuable to employees to have a baseline understanding of the moral expectations while they're at the job. Very thoughtful, intelligent comment. You know, I'm not sure that the reading that I gave you, that the student refers to, made a sufficient distinction between a company's code of ethics and a profession's code of ethics. I think there's a big difference. The NSPE code of ethics is not an employee code of ethics. The NSPE code of ethics is a professional code of ethics. Any company can create a code of ethics, and they probably should. But I think that there's a different tone and a different significance when a profession, or in this case, the NSPE, a professional society, composes and distributes a code of ethics. I think that all companies should have code of ethics and that they're good. But personally, I take more seriously a profession's code of ethics. It may be that, and I think the student is entirely right, and the reading is entirely right, to say that to a certain degree, every code of ethics is an attempt to improve the optics of either a company or a profession, to raise the level of trust or respect in the public eye or the customer's eye or whoever. But that with a profession rather than a company, I guess I think, it doesn't matter what I think. There's just a difference between a company's code of ethics and a profession's or a professional society's code of ethics, which is worth noting. That's it. Well, there are plenty more very interesting comments. Obviously, I can't do them all, but just thought it was a really great discussion in week one, and I'm looking forward to the discussion in week two.